This session, I am thrilled to bring two new presenters to the Data Conference series and to talk about something that I'm certainly passionate about and interested in learning more. If you attended our April session, I talked a great deal about the workforce here in Nebraska, and particularly the impacts of COVID-19 on the workforce. And this is going to build on some of what we learned there, drilling a little deeper into women and the workforce. Tiffany will be talking about women's role in the economy, that production by being in the workforce and earning an incomes, participating. And then Jamie is going to talk about something really interesting, some spending habits and some perceptions of spending, so the financial side of it. So women bringing money into the system and then women spending some of it. So looking forward to that. Couple reminders here before we get started. We are recording. We are going to make that available to you on a website. I'll put that in the chat in just a minute. And about a week after the conference, we'll have that edited and we'll put all the materials as well as that there. Let me provide this to you, but don't worry about grabbing it now. We will send an email to all those that registered when the recording is available. Following your attendance today, please complete an evaluation of your experience with us. We want to provide exceptional programming and your feedback is really important. Throw that link right there for you. Trying to use my chat the correct way. Once we introduce the presenters, use that chat for sort of technical or administrative questions that you just want myself or Matt Harrington, our host, to see or help you with. For substantive questions for the presenters, about what they're presenting, please use the Q&A. Enter your questions there at any time. I, as the moderator, will see them and I will make sure that they get answered throughout the presentation. We just have two presenters, so we have plenty of time for a great discussion on this important topic. So get those questions in using your Q&A. With that, I want to introduce our two panelists before we begin. You'll throw your cameras on so you can just say hi. Hi. I'm so excited to have them. Can you tell? Presenting first will be Jamie Wagner, PhD, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, and Director of the Center for Economic Education at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And economic education was a big topic in the Nebraska legislature this session, so we're really excited to talk to you. We also have Tiffany Seibert-Ekel, MA and Research and Policy Director for the Women's Fund of Omaha. My newest friend, working on a research project with her right now, and thrilled to talk through some of that today. So Jamie, I'm going to let you kick us off. I'll be right here with you if you need anything.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and I was asked to present this. So I will say that I actually am no longer an assistant professor. I am an associate professor. So I just received tenure and promotion, and I'm so excited. Yeah. So I'm going to be at UNO forever now. So thanks. So really what I'm going to focus on, I'm going to do a kind of a two-part presentation where I'm looking at the effects of gender differences in financial decision-making on household financial behaviors and outcomes. So looking at how there's a difference between males and females and what their financial decisions are like. So it can be kind of, and it's really important because women tend to outlive men, more women are going to college now, the dynamics are changing. So this is a paper by myself and Bill Walstead. He's a retired professor now at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So this is a project he and I have been working on for a couple years. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. I don't know, I'm econ nerdy, so if you like that, you can follow me at Prof. JWags. And then the second part of this, so I think I have about 25 minutes, I think I saw. So Josie, please, virtually, grab me by the reins and cut me off. But looking at Nebraska data in the 2018 National Financial Capability Study. So we'll talk through that as well. But this, I think we need to always really humanize research, and that's where this comes from. And so my inspiration is my grandma, and it's kind of a morbid reason why she's my inspiration, but her, and those are my two kids, Bella and Brooke, and they got to meet them February 2020, like literally weeks before, we just kind of shut down. So I'm so thankful that my grandma got to meet Brooke, because she hasn't seen him since. But my grandma and grandpa had a very traditional marriage, as far as he was the breadwinner, he was the financial decision maker. I'm pretty sure my grandpa had never changed a diaper in his entire life, and he had 4 kids. And my grandma was completely the homemaker. But my grandpa passed away, and my grandma has no idea what she's doing with her finances. She has no idea. She didn't even know if she had $300 to buy a new stove, or if she could buy a plane ticket to go visit one of her kids. She had no idea. And that's really, really scary. My grandpa has been gone for, like, I think 6 years now, maybe 7, maybe a little longer, and she still just has no idea. Luckily, my grandma has my dad, who is taking care of her financially and is, helping support her, but that's not the case for most people. And so I was really thinking through this, and I was like, wow, is there a difference in how women are making decisions? And we have to stop this before we have more grandmas of the world. I love her, but she's got to learn her finances. So the previous thought was that partners share the financial decision making. But that's really not how it's actually, that was the thought, but research is saying not at all. People are compartmentalizing it. One person is taking the bulk of it. And whether that's all the men or all the female, or the male or the female in the relationship, or whoever it is, any case one person in a partnership is taking on all the financial responsibilities, it can be really problematic. So when investing in savings, for example, females are more likely to delegate the financial decision-making to their male partner. And it's, and I hear this anecdotally with my friends of, oh, I just let my husband take care of it, and those sort of things. And that's really, like, always just, no, you have to know this stuff. So I use the 2018 National Financial Capability Study, and I'll talk more about this and some of the findings specific to Nebraska at the tail end of this presentation. But it's a really large sample for financial literacy. It's about 27,000. It's nationally representative. There are 500 participants per state, with oversampling in several states. And this is a triannual survey, which has been done since 2009. So it's really, the 2018 just came out like 2 summers ago. And so it's one of the most comprehensive studies about financial behaviors. So they ask, I'm going to scooch over to here though, financial behaviors. So the survey is split into 10 sections after they ask for demographics. So it's very large demographics. Then they ask about your financial attitudes and behaviors, financial advisors, money management, retirement accounts, source of income, home and mortgages, credit cards, other debt, insurance, financial self-assessment, and financial literacy. So it is a very comprehensive financial survey, one of the most comprehensive. There are 6 questions about financial literacy, the big 5 plus 1 additional one. So looking at interest accrual, inflation, relationship between bond prices and interest rates, which is notoriously the hardest question on the big 5. The difference between a 15 and 30-year mortgage, the difference between risk in stocks and mutual funds, the rule of 72, and then some various financial education questions as far as where did you take it? Did you receive financial education in high school, college, through an employer, through the military, those sort of things. So it is kind of the only survey that is doing this. And the 2009 survey is kind of the outlier. It was the beginning one, but from 2012 on, you can really kind of make some longer comparisons. Now, to note though, that these are cross-sectional, so it is not a longitudinal study, that they are not surveying the same 27,000, but it does look at a nationally representative change over time. So in my study, I really focused on credit card behaviors and wealth building behaviors. And the reason I did this is because there's a lot of decision making around those. With credit cards, you have to decide, how you're behaving with those credit cards month after month. Additionally, not appropriately handling your credit cards can be very problematic, right? You can be denied credit, your credit becomes much more expensive, all those sort of things that become very tough to navigate in the future. Additionally, you have these wealth building behaviors looking at emergency funds, non-retirement investments, non-employer retirement accounts, and then seeing how much they need for retirement. These are behaviors that if you don't do them, when you get to the point where you need them, it's been too late, right? If you haven't figured out how much you need for retirement, there's no going back. You can't, unless you know something I don't, you can't go back in time and do that. And so just looking at how do men and women differ in these different behaviors. I'm going to mostly, just for the sake of brevity, focus on the credit card behaviors. There are some similarities with the wealth building behaviors, but I can't give out the paper yet, but it's going to be published here hopefully in the next year. So very excited to be submitting it and getting it published. Here are some of the descriptive statistics, so you can look at these credit card behaviors. You're roughly between 52 and 65% are doing this in a good way. So you can read this as 56% are paying off their credit card in full each month. 53% don't carry credit card balance minimum, or don't carry credit card balance. 64% are paying more than the credit card minimum, and about 65 think that they have a good or very good credit record. And so how I split this up is I'm looking at the participants in this survey. Now, I'm looking at the difference in combining a marital status and the gender from the survey. So there's a male-female question, and then there's a question later on that says, are you single, married, living with a partner? And so I have the single household decision-making. They are the sole decision makers of their house, right? That's where they're at. So single males and single females. Then I looked at the joint household. So there is a survey question, and this is only asked of people who are married or cohabitating. It says, who in the household is the most knowledgeable about saving, investing, and debt? You, someone else, are equally knowledgeable. And so I split it up into these 6 different behaviors. So you have the male or female. So however they responded to the gender question, and then so for example, if they were a male, and then to this question, they said, you are the decision maker, then they become the male decision maker. If they were female and answered that they were the most knowledgeable, they were the female decision maker, and so on and so forth. So we combine those two to create these categories to decide who was that. And I do understand there is kind of a little bit of a jump for the most knowledgeable to be making the decisions, but there is a lot of research that says that the person who is the most knowledgeable, and that can be in relative terms. It doesn't have to be in absolute terms. They are the main financial decision makers. So we are making the assumption that if they think they're the most knowledgeable, then they are the ones who are making the decisions. So here is the regression results. And for those of you who are not regression fans, just let me explain this to you. It can be a lot to look at these and what you see. So these are just the variables of the decision making in the financial literacy score. All these categories are compared to a male single person. So a single household who's headed by a male. So in this case, how you interpret this single female is 12.5 percentage points less likely to pay their credit card in full than a single male. And with the stars, it means they're all significant. So what you can see with these financial decision making is that females in general, but even males, are worse off in their financial decision making regarding credit card behaviors than single men. Except for this one, which is non-significant. But what's also really scary is that I like to compare the male decision maker to the female decision maker, right? So these are kind of comparable households. So a male decision maker is only just shy of 8 percentage points less likely to pay their credit card in full, while a female is 22% less likely to pay their credit card in full compared to a single male. That is a very stark difference in that. And when you compare the females are at a massive disadvantage compared to males across the board. And that is extremely problematic when you're thinking about what are they doing. So if they're not paying their credit card in full, that means they're accruing interest. And I always like to say that interest can either work for you or against you, right? You can either earn interest, that compound interest is really nice when you're earning it, but when you're having to pay compound interest, it can be kind of suffocating. So all but one gendered variation of being a financial decision maker are significantly less likely to engage in any of the credit card behaviors compared to male singles financial decision makers. But again, comparing those female decision makers to the male decision makers shows a major gap in the magnitude. So again, just for example, the females who are the decision maker are 22 percentage points less likely to pay their credit card in full compared to a single male, while the males who are the decision maker are only 8 percentage points. And you could see that difference kind of across the board. So we're comparing about 5 percentage points to 12 percentage points, about 6 to 9, and about 4 to 9. So this one is definitely the largest in magnitude, but you can see that women are at a major disadvantage. Even here, looking at the equal decision maker, they're still at a really bad disadvantage regarding these financial decision making. On the wealth building side, again, I'm not reporting the results, but you don't see quite as stark of a difference, but there still is a very large difference between men and women making decisions in the household. And again, that is really concerning because you're talking about wealth building behaviors and saving for retirement and behaviors that there's no way to correct for them. So the results suggest that women, regardless of financial decision-making status, are at a disadvantage compared to single males, and in many cases compared to any males regarding these credit card behaviors. And that is kind of the main conclusion. Even we split it by age to see if there's a generational difference that, this is just, the older women are struggling with it, but the younger women, because this is a survey from 18 and up, maybe the 18 to 35-year-olds are not suffering from this. And it's just as bad for all women in all age groups. So something has to change, and it has to change soon, or we're gonna see some problems for women here in the future. Now, kind of switching over to a little bit more about the data, I did some comparisons looking at national versus Nebraska data, just kind of making some general comparisons. Now, you can look at the differences across states for literally every question, and I think there's about 120 questions on it. We are not going through every question for this. That doesn't seem like worth our time. But just some key points that I thought were interesting, just so you can see that the male-female split is about equal. And I know that this is the Nebraska Data Conference, but I threw in Iowa just because, especially in Omaha, we're so close to Iowa, and just as also kind of a little bit of a comparison. But there is about the same split. Nebraska and the U.S. look, and their gender differences, and you can see that we're probably pretty similar with our education attainment. Maybe a little bit more college or some college, and maybe slightly better than Iowa here. But when you're coming to a bachelor's degree, 2 percentage points, I'm not sure if that's probably even statistically significant. So we're right on average. They pulled a pretty nationally representative sample from the two states. Here's some information about spending compared to your income. So when we want to think about this, over the past year, how would you say your household spending was less than, more than, or about equal to your income? We definitely want to be at equal or less than. And so we're seeing that, 41% are spending less their income and 38% are spending about equal to their income. We are just slightly lower in the spending more than your income, but I don't believe that is statistically significant. So it looks like, on the whole, though, when you sum up these two, it appears in Nebraska we're doing pretty good, and we know that, especially with the last financial crisis. Which, when I talk about the financial crisis, I feel like it was yesterday, but it was definitely more than 10 years ago now at this point. But you can see that we've really shifted, and I believe from the 2009 to 2018 survey, it has really shifted even nationally. That change in the spending. So I think that's good from a financial literacy standpoint as far as moving us in the right direction. Have you set aside an emergency fund? So we're split pretty equally. 48% say yes, 48% say no. So about average. Iowa is probably a little bit lower. Again, probably not statistically different, but setting aside an emergency fund. This is fun. So this is the financial literacy. So I said that they have 6 questions. And so this is kind of just a measure. Now, there's a big fight in the financial literacy world of like, what does 6 questions mean versus what do, 100 questions? And researchers have done the difference in that. And we kind of come to the same conclusion as far as like, you can answer about 2/3 of the questions. Whether you ask 6 questions or 100 questions, they can only answer about 2/3 of the questions. So here's an average. So they're answering 3 questions correctly in the US. The mean number of incorrect answers, because they can't answer I don't know, is 1.35. Nebraska's 3.37, Iowa's 3.2. Alabama and Georgia are the lowest with an average of 2.77 and 2.73. Nebraska and Utah are tied with first. And I kept like going back, like, is it really is that really true? So Nebraska is definitely, I wouldn't say 3.37 is the best, but we're doing better than the average. So I think that works. And this is one question from those financial literacy questions, and it asks, if interest rates rise, what will typically happen to bond prices? So this is not only just an example of a type of question, this is actually the hardest of the 6 questions to answer. So I guess I was anticipating more of not a webinar, but the answer is there is an inverse relationship that if interest rates rise, bond prices are falling. So Nebraska is answering this question slightly better than the US and Iowa. So I think that's really good. I'm pretty happy with that. So you can see that there's no relationship, and then they can say don't know or prefer not to say, which I counted as a 0 in my research. So Iowa's doing about average with the US, but Nebraska is a little bit ahead, and I believe that is statistically different. Some other publications, specifically of mine, there are thousands of publications, and there's some wonderful research that has come about from this survey, but just some different work that I have another paper looking at how the difference in required versus voluntary financial education is affecting behaviors, and looking specifically at savings behaviors. I also have a paper, and you can see that I have a lot of papers with Bill Walstead. I will say he was my dissertation advisor, and now has become kind of a mentor, friend, wonderful researcher, and I'm thankful that he wants to research with me. But then this paper came out of my dissertation with the effects of financial education on short-term and long-term behaviors. So we look at how does education affect certain behaviors, and we find that the long-term behaviors are more affected by financial education, which is really wonderful for practitioners because it gives them a guide of what they should be focusing on as they're teaching. And the way we separated short-term and long-term behaviors is focusing on behaviors that have immediate feedback. So a credit card has regular feedback, right? Within a month that you didn't pay your credit card in full and you got charged interest. But long-term behaviors such as like an emergency fund, you don't know that until you need an emergency fund. You don't know that. Also looking at a big focus of mine is financial education, if you haven't guessed that, but looking at financial education and how it affects income and education groups. And in that, I find that the people that need financial education the most, so the people that are statistically worse with financial literacy, the low income and low education, they have a larger magnitude of effects by the financial education. So what that's saying is that the people who need it benefit more from it. And I think that that's really powerful information. And then just a general analysis of the effects of financial education on financial literacy and behaviors. So with that, I will say thank you so much. And thank you, Josie, for inviting me. Please feel free to email me, or you can tweet at me. That's fine. I'm really looking forward to Tiffany's presentation to hear more about the workforce. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Really appreciate it. We did have one question come in that we'll probably have a pretty lively discussion around. Oh, and by the way, really happy to celebrate you being an associate professor. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Glad you could celebrate with us today. So a really important question. We will probably talk more about this, but want to just get some quick thoughts from you before we move on to Tiffany. Was income considered in the percentage of women not able to pay their credit card payments? Women make far less than men and are often more burdened with childcare expenses than a single man or a man in general. So how'd you deal with that in the model?
Thank you. That is a really great question, and I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. We did control for education, income, whether they had children or not. We controlled for a lot of demographics. And age, they're just not included in the regression because the table looks, or they're not included in the results description because it's super long. So yes, income is controlled for in there.
So a woman with a family, no matter what her income is, so controlling for income, controlling for age, controlling for the fact that she has a family, she is still less likely to
control pay. And controlling for employment status. So there is a control for employment status, whether they're working full-time, part-time, not in the labor force. So controlling for all thoughtful demographics that would probably affect this, women are still at a disadvantage. We do even control for, state state effects too, because there is some geography differences. So even with all that, women, it's not looking good. So we got to change something.
Yeah, I'm interested in the psychology of this. I saw the presentation before and I was really surprised. I was like, maybe I'm not reading it right. I couldn't wait to have this conversation. So tons to dig into, but let's turn it over to Tiffany now, and then we will come back with some more questions for both of you. Hey, Tiffany.
Hi all, and thank you, Dr. Wagner. That was really interesting and provides, I think, a nice or interesting segue to my presentation today. My name is Tiffany Seibert-Yakel. I'm Research and Policy Director at the Women's Fund of Omaha. And for those who may not be familiar, the Women's Fund is an organization that works on the most critical issues facing women and girls by identifying issues through research, funding solutions through grant making, and leading dynamic change by advocating for effective policy solutions. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about women's ever-evolving role in our economy. And in doing research for this presentation, there's a lot of really tremendous information about the cultural norms and societal norms that have changed, but also the legal structures that have impacted the ways in which women have participated in the economy. And interestingly enough, I think a statistic worth raising is that women actually weren't allowed to get credit cards without the signature or approval of a man until 1974. So obviously there's been a lot of evolution in the gender roles we play both in the economy and at home, and still continue to need to be a lot of changes there as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the pay gap and how that impacts women's participation in the economy and contributing factors to the pay gap, and then also some potential ways to address that. And I want to make a couple of disclaimers. The first being that I am not a PhD with tenure. I am a person who deeply values data and research and relies on that data and research to inform and support our advocacy on behalf of women and girls for system change. I also want to note that The data and information I'll be presenting today will be very much presented on the binary, so either male or female. And we also know that that is not the reality of our world, and there are many folks who do not identify as either male or female. And so I just want to name that as a place where the research needs to be more fully fleshed out. The data that I'll present and share with you today is primarily from survey data. So it will have given the participants an opportunity to identify either as male or female, but there were not non-binary options presented to them. So that is something I just wanted to name, because at the Women's Fund, we acknowledge that our work and our advocacy is on behalf of all of those who experience inequities and marginalization based upon their gender. So with that, I want to dive in a little bit into women's role in the economy. Obviously, there's been significant changes, especially since, the 1950s. Women's increased education, training, and work experience, along with anti-discrimination laws, have led to real gains for women in the workplace over the past 40 to 50 years. Women prior to the pandemic, so hold that asterisk, prior to the pandemic, women represented about half the population, but were significantly still less likely to be in the workforce. About 65% of Nebraska women ages 16 and up were engaged in the workforce, were part of the labor force, compared to about 75% of men. And so we want to ask ourselves the questions about why that is. Obviously societal norms have evolved so that it is not necessarily the expectation that women must stay home and care for children. Two working parents, two working people, married women working is less a societal abnormality these days. So while of course there will be some role of preference in this, one could argue that men could also choose to stay home and care for their children. So what accounts for these differences? What are the systemic barriers as we look at it that present hindrances or reasons why women may not be able to engage in the workforce as fully as they would like to? And so the very real challenges there are women tend to still maintain the majority of caregiving responsibilities in families, whether that be child care, also, and increasingly so, caring for adult parents. So that creates a barrier to women's full participation in the economy. Tied to that is the cost and availability of childcare. Childcare is an incredibly expensive workforce input. And so many women have to make the decision about whether it's economically viable for them to join the workforce. And again, that's a choice men could make as well, or the second parent could make as well. But when we will dive into the pay gap data, much of this relies on, when parents are making that decision, much of it relies on who is more highly compensated. That tends to be the man on the aggregate, and so it will then lead to more women being the ones to step out of the workforce for caregiving. And then of course we have to examine the workplace settings and to what extent women are experiencing violence and discrimination in inhospitable and inequitable workplaces. And so those are sort of the areas that that the Women's Fund is interested in diving into, the structural barriers that prevent women from participating as fully in the workplace as they would like to. So as I mentioned with the asterisk, that 65% of women engaging in the workforce was prior to the pandemic. The economic repercussions that have been associated with the pandemic have largely been borne by women, to the extent that it's been called a she-cession. Women experienced more job loss throughout the pandemic. This is because industries which tend to have greater representation by women were hit the hardest by job loss. So hospitality, education, health, government, childcare, retail, etc. Beyond that, school and childcare closures, and the then increased need for childcare was most often taken care of by women and mothers. There's a lot of research, lots of articles about this. I'm just providing a few that mothers' work hours fell 4 to 5 times as much as fathers during the pandemic. Women were 3 times more likely than men to not work, to step out of the workforce to care for children. And then I would also note that as we are trying to get back to normal, or from our perspective, try to build something better, the recovery has not been equal. There are substantially less women on payroll, 4.2 million less women on payroll today than at the start of the pandemic. And that's compared with 3.5 fewer men. So the impact was disproportionately borne by women. The reverberating or the ripple effect of childcare closures, school closures, was borne primarily by women. And now, as jobs are beginning to recover, women are not participating equally in that recovery. And part of that may still be remaining childcare challenges, et cetera. But I'd also want to note that the job loss and impact was felt even more firmly by Black, Indigenous, and women of color, and that impact continues to be felt today, as the Black adult women's unemployment rate is 1.7 times higher than white women's, and the Latina unemployment rate is 1.5 times higher. So much of the gains that had been made in workforce participation for women have potentially been wiped out by the recession and the economic and the resulting economic impact. And the truth is that that not only has an impact for the financial stability of women and families today, but as Jamie mentioned, as Dr. Wagner mentioned, this will reverberate in the future. You know, any step away from the workforce will have long-term effects for women's career advancement and wage equity. This chart is from McKinsey and Company. They do lots of great data and research on women in the workplace, but it just illustrates the difference between mothers and fathers as a result of the pandemic for downsizing careers and then considering leaving the workforce. So I would just note on the bottom of this chart, where 13% of fathers with kids under 10 considered leaving the workforce, that was almost 25% for women. So this, I think we will not know the impact of this pandemic for a little while, but it will be substantial on the growth and gains that women had made as participants in the economy. So let's dive into the pay gap a little bit. In Nebraska, a woman earns 78.5 cents for every dollar earned by a man. So this is an average woman compared to an average man in Nebraska. This is holding full-time year-round work constant. So these are comparing median annual incomes of full-time workers. Since this is a data conference, the definition of full-time would be any worker who has worked 35 hours or more per week for 50 to 52 weeks out of the last 12 months. So again, this is for holding full-time workers constant. Women make about 78% of what a man earns in Nebraska. This gap is even more pronounced when we look at the intersection of race and gender. So for every dollar that a white male earns in Nebraska, a white woman earns 78 cents, an Asian woman earns 69 cents, a Black woman earns 61 cents, a Native woman earns 60 cents, and a Latina woman earns 56 cents. So again, this is full-time year-round work, 16 and up, ages 16 and up, and this is American Community Survey data. There's often a differentiation made between annual earnings and shorter term earnings, the wage gap is smaller when we look at comparing men and women for median weekly earnings. In Nebraska, in 2019, the average median weekly earnings for women in full-time work was $786 compared to $940 for men. So again, we're still holding full-time work constant, but this, the median weekly wages as compared to the annual that we saw prior, the median will include workers who do not work full-time year-round. So this would be full-time, but not necessarily year-round, which is more likely to be women. It also, this median data would not include wages for self-employed workers, whereas the annual income data does. And also, interestingly, this data would not include annual bonuses, which would be represented in the annual data. And the reality is that men tend to be disproportionately represented in industries that provide compensation in annual benefits, and so, or in sort of bonus structures. So that explains some of the difference between when we look at both full-time, but comparing median weekly to median annual wages. So what explains the pay gap? I want to start by saying this is a very complex issue. We are not going to solve it today. We are not even going to begin to cover all of the issues that that impact the pay gap, that reinforce the pay gap. But I did want to just give a pretty high level overview of some of the more commonly attributed reasons for the pay gap, provide a little bit of data that we look at, and then share some of the strategies that the Women's Fund sees to pursue equity in compensation between men and women. So is it education? Nope. Is it that women tend to work in different jobs? The answer is yes. And I think we should dig a little deeper into that and encourage ourselves to think about why women may tend to enter different professions. Is it because it's what they've seen available to them? Is it because other types of professions may not provide the environments that are conducive to supporting women and their subsequent caregiving responsibilities, et cetera. So I don't think we should stop by just saying women choose different jobs and so shoulder shrug, there's a pay gap. And we'll dig into that a little bit as well. Do women work less hours? So all of the data I provided so far has been holding hours worked constant for the most part. It's been considering only full-time work. There is some data to demonstrate that women do work less hours. And so we're not going to have time to dig into this today as well, but I would encourage us to think about why is that? Is that a choice? Is it a result of cultural and gender norms we hold in community as well as in our homes? So again, let's think a little more deeply about that. And then discrimination and bias. Is that still a contributing factor to the pay gap? And the answer is yes. We had an opportunity to work with Dr. Schaefer, and she provided some analysis for us of CPS data, and what she found when holding the effects of education and industry constant, that gender is a significant predictor of income in Nebraska, and a man is likely to make $12,000 more in wages per year than a woman for full-time work, again, at the same level of education and when we hold the industry constant. So, so let's look at this data a little bit more deeply. So women actually are more highly educated than men and continue to make less than men at all levels of education. So this is using ACS, American Community Survey data. I have both Omaha and the state of Nebraska included. What you can see is that at every level of education, men earn more than women. So men with less than a high school graduate level of education earn less than women, or earn more than women. And then all the way up to men with a graduate or professional degree earn more than women with that same level of education. So I would note this, this data is not full-time. So this is the first chart that I've had that does not hold full-time constant. So this would be median earning in the past 12 months, regardless of amount of work. What we see though, again, Dr. Schaefer pulled data for us on this same sort of comparing by education level, and the same pattern existed with the exception of women did earn slightly more for those with some college but no degree. Otherwise, at every other level of education, men earn significantly more than women when holding education constant. So do women work in different industries and different jobs? There is a lot going on here. This is great analysis by our friends at CPAR as well. This is digging into this idea of occupational segregation, the tendency for men and women to be disproportionately employed in different industries and occupations. This is the single largest explanatory factor of the aggregate gender wage gap. Women tend to be clustered in industries with lower pay. And so that's what we see. This is in Nebraska. This is all full-time workers comparing male to female. You can see the difference in pay. What I think is really important to point out here is that there are, even when we hold industry constant, right, that men typically make more than women. So in these 18 industry categories, the only industries for which women make more than men are arts, entertainment, and recreation. You're down near the bottom. Administrative support and waste management services. And then we've got wholesale trade. So regardless of the industry, men make more than women with those limited exceptions. I think it's also important to note that the top 3 paying industries overall are dominated by men. So utilities is 82% male, information is 63% male, and professional, scientific, and technical services and management of companies and enterprises is 62% male. And then the industries in which women represent the majority of workers are healthcare and social assistance, educational services, finance and insurance, and accommodation and food service. And even in those industries where women make up the majority of employees, they still make less than their male counterparts. So that was looking at industry. Now we're going to take a look at occupation within industries. And again, the major takeaway here is that when we hold occupations constant, men in the same occupation make more than women. And again, this is all full-time. We are comparing all full-time workers. In fact, so these are the top 10 paying occupations based on median income. Annual median income for full-time work, and you can see the comparison of women's earnings to men in each of those. So computer and math occupations, women make about 81%, but look at legal occupations, women make about 50% of what men make. So this slide shows you the top 10 overall highest compensated occupations in Nebraska. And again, you can see women's earning as a percentage of men's. This next slide, this is the lowest earning occupations. And you can see that generally the gap is a little smaller, but still remains. So men in the same lower paid occupations are making more than women in those same occupations. I would note that it's not listed on here because the chart would have just been way too big, the table, but the only occupation category in which women received pay parity was, quote, installation, maintenance, and repair occupations, where women made 102% of men's earnings. So I think we need to dig into that a little bit. I think we don't traditionally think of women as engaged in installation, maintenance, and repair occupations. So perhaps it's a sample size issue. This is a 5-year average. These are the 5-year estimates. So hopefully that one would think that would accommodate for some of that, but a bit of a surprising data finding there. And of course, discrimination and bias. Gender differences in occupations and industries, as well as differences in gender roles and gender division of labor, remain important. And research based on experimental evidence strongly suggests that discrimination cannot be discounted. The research paper that I've cited here reviewed data and literature from 1980 to 2010 on the gender pay gap, and ultimately concluded that we cannot statistically eliminate the impact of discrimination on the pay gap. The truth is, though, the way that discrimination reverberates is hard to tell. Does it show up in that employers are less likely to to see specific women in specific roles? Are they less likely to hire them for fear that they will work less because they have caregiving responsibilities? So it's all sort of reinforcing, and none of this is clear and easy and a clean, easy solution. As I said, we're not going to solve it in the 25 minutes that I'm going to chat with you today. So what are the benefits of closing the gap? Obviously, greater economic stability for women and families. Women represent a significant number of heads of households in families with children. So not only will we support women by ensuring that they are paid equitably, but we'd also be better supporting their families. Think about if the pay gap, which is approximately $11,000 a year on average, were closed. That would pay for a year of childcare for one child. That would pay for a year of in-state college tuition. That would pay for a significant down payment, mortgage payment, rent. I mean, think of the economic impact. If women were paid in Nebraska the same as men, the poverty rate for women would be reduced in half, and the poverty rate among single mothers would be reduced by more than half. So there are substantial opportunities today for financial stability of families, but also in the long term, artificially depressed wages then artificially depress investments in long-term economic stability and wealth building, like Dr. Wagner discussed. So when we make less, we're able to contribute less to Social Security, able to commit less to retirement, to savings, and that has reverberations in decades to come. There is also a pretty strong business case for committing to equitable pay practices. Workplaces and workers really value equitable pay practices and transparent practices. So there are significant gains to be made in recruitment, retention, and productivity for businesses. There's also strong and growing research to suggest that when a company has greater gender diversity in their leadership, they are more likely to experience above average profitability. And so you can't put women in leadership if you're not bringing them in and keeping them moving up the ladder, and pay equity and making specific efforts to support equitable workplace opportunities are how you get those women to leadership positions. And then finally, what a tremendous gain and impact the increasing participation of women in our economy has had to get us to where we are. But the growth and productivity in our economy has largely stalled. Think of the gains we could make if we took that 65% workforce participation and brought that closer to men's level of workforce participation, the kinds of economic activity that could generate. I would also say that one of the largest and most pressing needs we hear from businesses in our community and communities across the state is that they need workers, they need a qualified workforce. And I think women are ready and willing to step in and engage more meaningfully with changes that support that continued engagement and reduce the barriers to them doing so. At the Women's Fund, we really think about systemic barriers. We don't believe we need to fix women. We believe we need to fix the institutions that surround and inform and create the structures in which we are moving. And so there has been some good research around the impact of pay transparency and how in particular, there's been some recent research around negotiations that when women have more information about salary and that can inform their negotiations, they are more likely to engage and be more successful. So I also think as a business, if you want to make a commitment to equity, pay audits and evaluating are the pay differences for similarly situated workers in your workforce based on job-related factors like education, time in position, time in tenure, performance. And if you can't explain the differences in pay based on those, then you need to fix those and eliminate those disparities. One priority for the Women's Fund at the policy level has been banning salary history in hiring practices. Since we cannot eliminate the impact of discrimination on the salaries that we carry, when our next job salary is based upon our past job, we are essentially building in and continuing the inequities that may have driven our salary at our last job. So what we are advocating for is that salary history cannot guide and inform job offers unless voluntarily provided. And there's been really great research out of the Boston School of Law that compared jurisdictions that had a salary history ban in place and those that did not, and found that when job changing workers in locations with a salary history ban tended to earn 5 to 6% more on average than comparable job changers where there wasn't a salary history ban in place. And the effects of this were even more pronounced for women, 8% increases, and African Americans, 13%, with really very little cost to the employer. So we think this is a huge opportunity and are encouraging our policymakers to consider efforts to ban salary histories, but this is also something that businesses can implement in their hiring practices right now to eliminate implicit or pre-existing bias that would then continue into new employment. And of course, making our workplaces more supportive of the dual roles that many women often play, which is caregiver and committed employee. So flexible workplace policies, paid leave. You saw in the federal government's response to the pandemic that they made paid leave more available. And this is exactly why, so that workers didn't have to choose between their health, the health of their families and their work, but also they didn't have to leave the workforce because their school was closed, because their childcare was closed. They were able to remain committed to their workplace, but also navigate those new and sort of unprecedented level of challenge in caring for kids while also staying in the workplace. And then affordable childcare. Childcare is absolutely an investment in our workforce, and we do not do enough to recognize that. Parents cannot work without a safe place for their children to be. And so to the extent that we want to support more full engagement in the economy, we need to support affordable childcare for parents and particularly for women. Of course, all then efforts to create equitable and welcoming places for women, regardless of the industry, regardless of occupation, will require eliminating workplace discrimination and violence. There's really troubling research that finds women experience a tremendously high level of violence and harassment in food service, and that is one of the largest industries employing women. So continuing to monitor workplaces and laws that protect women in the workplace. And then, of course, addressing occupational segregation is a very deep and wide problem, but we have to be mindful about educational opportunities that drive women to certain occupations, and ensuring that women have access to all avenues of employment and can see themselves in all industries and occupations. So with that, we've solved the gender pay gap, and I'm happy to answer any questions or have a further discussion.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you for the work you're doing in this area. I think we have time for a broader discussion, but I will encourage folks to get your questions in, put them in the Q&A. It is rare that, especially in COVID times when many people are still working from home, that we have this opportunity to engage on this topic. So let's do it while we can. We did have a question come in for Tiffany. For men and women that are working full-time, are men more likely to work more hours? For example, are men more likely to work overtime compared to women?
There is some research that alludes to that even in the full-time designation, that so the full-time designation of 35 plus, that women may work around 40 and men are working 42, right? So I do think there is some evidence to support that. Then the question becomes why is that, right? And I think is it because women just don't want to work those extra hours? I think that's not the right answer, right? I think it is those additional caregiving responsibilities of children that tend to fall more heavily on mothers than fathers. And again, I want to give a shout out to all the other parents out there, that the second parents or the non-bio parents that are doing it and carrying those and sharing that equitably. But unfortunately, that is still not the norm. And in many cases, women are predominantly responsible for that second shift is what they call it.
Absolutely, and I think we should talk more about that. I think that might even tie in with some of Jamie's work. Another question came in on the chat. I believe this is for you, Tiffany. Is there a difference between the public, private, and nonprofit sectors in the wage gap?
I don't think we know that exactly, and that is a good suggestion for future research.
Tiffany and I are smiling because we are working with our colleague Jody Benenson right now on doing some analysis of the wage gap for the nonprofit sector. I will say that we know the public sector has more transparency about wages, and for that reason they tend to do the right thing. They know that it'll be published more often, so it goes to one of the policy suggestions that you offered, what the public sector already does. We're already letting people know what people get paid in. Great, keep getting your questions in. Jamie, thanks for turning your camera on. So I want to start with a broad question related to the wage gap, but Jamie, you might have some thoughts on this too. So you mentioned bias and discrimination as a reason why there might be a wage gap. And it has been my experience, I would even say personal experience, no one likes to hear that they're biased. No one wants to think that they are making decisions based on factors that shouldn't matter, like gender, to what someone makes. But your analysis seems to suggest that there's room for that, right? And I think, not to reveal a privileged conversation, but you said that a lot of times when you're presenting data on the wage gap and what I would call descriptive data, so the wage gap by industry or the wage gap by occupation, that people say, well, then it's education or it's something else. And so talk to me why you wanted that regression analysis, why regression analysis is a tool to help us, and again, I think Jamie, you could jump in on this too, to be able to say, it's actually something else, right? There are lots of good reasons for a pay gap, but we're still seeing it no matter what.
I am struggling with where to start with that. There was a lot to that question. I think it's important to where you started that question, right? I don't think people go into hiring decisions, salary negotiations, thinking, oh, it's a woman, I get to pay her less, right? Or at least maybe I'll give folks the credit about like I'll try to think the best of folks. So I think then at a policy level, as I said, we don't approach this work from a sort of fix the person, but fix the institution approach. And so we want to believe that employers on the whole are good, right? And want to do what's best and value their employees for all they bring. But the reality is that the data doesn't bear that out, that women are paid less than men. So then we want to say, well, it's because women don't have the same level of education. Not really true. Okay, well, then it's because women choose the wrong jobs. So it's really, I mean, we're constantly looking for an easy.
Or it's women work less, or women need to be in the home more, right? There will always be sort of another factor,
right,
that helps us to understand why a woman makes less.
Right.
But that's kind of the cool thing about this research. We can put a lot of things in this model and say, on average, if ever, we're looking at the same person on all of these factors, the only difference is man versus women. It seems to hold out. And I mean, I still think there's work to do with our model. I don't think we have every factor we could in there. So folks, throw in ideas for what you think we would need to include to help explain why a woman still makes less than a man. But yeah, once you put everything in the model, are we then sure that women, can we ever be sure that women do make less than men, and that is attributable to bias?
It's much, like you can't fix the problem unless you have the right diagnosis, right? We can't target our treatment unless we know the problem. And so the more data and the more rich the conversation about contributing factors and reinforcing factors, the better to support our solutions, right?
And so Jamie, kind of similar question to you. How do people respond to this idea that women are less financially knowledgeable? Women are making poor choices about their finances. I have to tell you, I didn't take it at face value. I wanted to know all those control factors for sure. I was really surprised. So how do you help people to understand why that might be?
So it's really, excuse me, it's really hard to diagnose this, or it's really hard to like give some sort of suggestion. So we're still kind of like I feel like in the literature, we're still in kind of the exploratory phase as far as like, this is what we're seeing, and we're seeing it across ages. I mean, we see even in like high schools that women seem to perform worse in financial literacy, are less financially literate than males. And so it's like, okay, so like it's hard to figure out, where did this start, and where is it going? Is it something that as a child you are talking to your male children differently, or allowing them to do certain things differently than you do with your female children? I don't know, like, and so it just becomes really hard. And then you also still have some of that self-selection into, this is kind of a STEM issue as far as, women tended, it's kind of closing. STEM is doing a really great job of closing, I think, their gender gap, or they're on the right path. And so, we're still facing that as far as like finance is very math heavy. And so women, and girls, little girls, are steering away from that. Why are they, and so it's all these things of why. And so I hate to say it, I don't have a good answer. And I don't even have a good solution about like what we can do. I don't know how to have like really targeted female specific financial literacy. And, we haven't quite looked into some of the systemic nature of finances. So it could be that the financial products themselves or the financial tools, there's some sort of bias there. But I can't speak to that personally. I'm just kind of in speculation on that one.
I definitely want to come back to finance education. We do have a couple Q&A coming in, and I encourage you to submit yours as well. Is there enough union participation in Nebraska to measure the wage gap in unionized workforce versus non-unionized workforces?
I saw that question come in, and I'm sorry, I just don't have the data to speak to that. I mean, I would assume there is, because wages are bound by contractual obligations and there's less discretion, I would assume the gaps would be less. However, there are gender dynamics that operate within union and depending upon the type of union, right? So I don't have any information to add to that, much like the nonprofit question. Like, I think that's a really interesting place to think about, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that one too. We're in the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, home to the Brennan Labor Institute. So I will reach out to our partners there and see. I know in some of the United States Census Bureau sources like the American Community Survey, we do have some data on if folks are union or not, but I don't know about the size, and then drilling down even deeper into that wage gap. But I'd certainly be interested. I think union is an institution that tries to grapple with some of those workplace rights. So it seems like maybe it should be lesser, but then maybe there's also some bias in those systems as well. It's a really interesting question. Another question came in: how do you allow for working gaps like maternity leaves? I assume that's in that pay gap study. So
I would say we use data that tries to account for it, and we also don't try. I mean, we also name it. So again, this is complex, right? So I think we try, when we are looking and able to show that disparities exist for people who are working full-time. So that is 35 hours a week for 50 to 52 weeks out of the year. So that would capture folks who are not taking any sort of leave, extended periods of leave, and we still see women making less than men. We also name it in that overall, when you compare median earnings generally, annual earnings generally, the gap is much wider than when you compare median earnings for full-time year-round. And so that would account for some of that time that women may step away from the workforce. The question then is why, right? Is it a choice? Is it to care for young children because no one else can? And so there's no value judgment there. I think those are pay differentials that could be explained and would be legal, right? But then the question becomes, what are we losing? Like, what are we losing for employers employing women if, and the other question is, men should also be able to take that time, right? So when we advocate for paid leave, it's not just paid leave for a person who gave birth, it's also paid leave, paid parental leave. So a non-birth parent can engage in that critical time in learning how to care for that tiny human that you have either brought into the world or adopted or brought into your home. That we don't advocate that should be just for women, that should also be available for men. So that extended gap or that leave time should help balance the gender equity within the home as well. And I would say there's work for businesses to do. There are a number of businesses who make that type of leave available to non-birth parents as well, but the culture does not allow them to feel like they can use it. And so we have a lot of work to do. The pay gap rightfully would account for leave, but I think it's a deeper question than that. Why is that just impacting women or moms? And how do we share that responsibility across parents if possible?
So in economics, we talk about this. Economics is the study of choices. That's what economics is. And so always something I talk about when we're thinking about labor decisions is there truly a choice, right? Or are you choosing between, like, what are you truly choosing between? And yes, women can choose to not have kids, but if you're forcing them to choose to not have kids for their job, are you really there's really no choice. And so it's always trying, and same thing with low income individuals. They can't just change their job because there's so much riding on it, that I always want to make sure I'm, very careful about talking about choices and whether those choices truly exist, right? Like, and fundamentally can exist. So I always think that with especially parents, do you have the choice to leave your job? You don't all the time,
Right. And coming out of the COVID-19, I know there's a lot of discussion about who was unemployed and why aren't they back at work now? But if we look at the unemployment by sector, we're not adding jobs back in the same sectors where folks were unemployed. So I think it really goes to your point about choices, Jamie. Do we actually have the choice, right? If I choose to take maternity leave, can I also choose not to make as much money? Do I also choose that, or is that put upon me? Really great points. Jamie, I want to talk a little bit about financial education. Nebraska, financial literacy. Why? Yeah, I mean, it's really wonderful. Like we love when we're sort of in the top. What do you think's happening there?
Well, so you were talking about legislation and financial literacy, and if you're not following it, LB 452 was just passed. So starting fall 2022, every high school student will graduate with a financial literacy course, and we're so excited. This has been at least a decade-long fight, and it has come up in legislation several times, and I am so excited to say that high schoolers will be now getting financial literacy as a requirement for graduation. So prior to this, we had done some survey work, and about 70% of students were getting personal finance. So it wasn't that they weren't getting anything, but now it's a requirement. I'm so excited. As far as what's going on in Nebraska, I think part of it is kind of a cultural thing. I mean, if you look at the last, I guess not the last recession, but during the financial crisis, that recession, Nebraska was very much kind of protected. And it's just because housing is very different here. People aren't spending in the same way, those sort of things. So I think some of it's along the lines of, we're kind of more fiscally conservative in Nebraska. And, I think that kind of plays to financial literacy's benefits. When you're, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I have to think too, if we're introducing legislation about financial literacy, there's sort of awareness. I'd love to know like how many other states have similar programs enacted on what timeline, right? Because that sort of speaks to what we value if we can pass legislation about it, for sure.
Yes. So I'm trying to pull up, this is the one good thing. Well, not one, but it is one of a few good things with virtual world. I'm going to put it in the chat, and it is a link to the Council for Economic Education, which is a national council, the survey of the states. And so 5 states, hold on, trying to find who, I think it's like 9 states require financial literacy to graduate. So I think it's about 9.
So we're leading in that way. So there's clearly something in the water here that makes us interested in that topic earlier than others.
So I will have to give the credit probably to the Nebraska Council on Economic Education, which is the leading financial education resource for K through 12 teachers in the state of Nebraska. And as the director of the Center for Economic Education, I'm on an umbrella underneath them. And so I serve mostly the Omaha area, K through 12, K through 16 teachers, and I provide financial literacy and economic literacy resources for students. So I guess this will be a call to you all. If you know of someone who needs some economic or personal finance lessons, please send me an email, jfwagner@unomaha.edu. You shouldn't have to create them. We have all of that for you. So, and the council is really wonderful. The Nebraska Council reaches, tens of thousands of students across the state every single year. We have banks in elementary schools. So we actually have operating bank branches in various elementary schools. We have about 30 going on. And so it's really wonderful. They, starting in kindergarten, they're getting these financial literacy lessons where they're saving money in an actual branch, and the students are the tellers. So it's such an incredible program. And the Nebraska Bankers Association, Richard Beyer, he is a huge supporter of the council. He's on our board and he loves financial literacy. So I think that, we have a lot of organizations that really value financial literacy and economic literacy, and they are helping us because we're kind of the experts as far as training it. They're putting their money towards us to help do this. So this is something you're passionate about, please reach out.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I had no idea. I feel bad, but I think it's wonderful to learn about and to realize that resource is here. I have 2 little kiddos in school, so I'm glad they will get that. I know I didn't. So there's certainly something to that. And then I was going to ask, so this seems like a real opportunity to sort of see how things change, because one of the questions I wrote down was, are those folks that say they're knowledgeable, right? So I am a woman decision maker in my house because I'm knowledgeable on this topic. Are they actually knowledgeable, right? Using that financial literacy score. And I wonder if there's not something to that. And maybe that's why women are not practicing good financial behaviors, right? We think we know, but maybe we don't totally understand it.
So the survey and the study does control for financial literacy. So it does control for the actual knowledge. And we did some robustness checks controlling for perceived knowledge, because your perceived knowledge probably informs some of your behaviors more than your actual knowledge. And this applies to a lot of different areas of life, not just in finances, but fake it till you make it mentality.
Right.
And even controlling for perceived knowledge, actual knowledge, it's not good for women.
Yeah.
So we do take that into account. And part of the robustness checks was looking at the discrepancies between perceived high knowledge. So they say like, oh, I am knowledgeable, but they have actually low levels of knowledge. And we control for all those different variations of where you actually are as far as your perception and your actual knowledge and the differences. So you've got like perceived high, actual high, perceived low, actual low. So they actually know where they're at and are there. And then you have perceived high, actual low, which is not good. So they're like overconfident. And then you have perceived low and actual high. So they're kind of on the opposite spectrum. And so we do control for that, and the results remain robust. So it's sad, but
yeah, it's impressive. It's something. So do you know anything about access to financial education? Is it that women, younger girls, are not receiving the same amount or have the same ability to access financial education? Could you say anything about that to explain the difference? I'm like obsessed with this idea that women make poor financial choices, if anyone was wondering.
So there could be some in that, because unless your state is requiring it, then financial literacy in a high school course or high school curriculum becomes you have to opt into it. And so maybe girls are shying away from opting in, maybe. And maybe at the college level, you do find that women are less likely to be economists, they're less likely to be finance majors. And so there could be some self-selection in there. But then I'm going to go with the Tiffany, the new Tiffany model, which is why. right? I love that Tiffany kept saying like, okay, so we see this, but why? And so again, you got to go like, okay, well, why are they not selecting into it? What is happening throughout their lives yeah. So I'm sure that there probably could be some access, and I don't have enough data to say that for anything serious.
Totally understand. Question came in. If you compare the 50 states controlling for policies that would support women, paid family leave, salary history bans, et cetera, are the wage gaps or employment gaps as drastic as some of those shown in the models we saw here? Great question, Angela.
I think that is a great question, and I would love to see that research study. I don't think I've seen it, right? I think there's research on sort of some of those pieces individually and impact, but I don't know that we've seen a broad based study of places where all of those interventions exist and what the overall impact has been on the wage gap.
I'm blanking on the name. Institute
for Women's Policy Research does a tremendous amount of work around this pay gap and really diving into the occupational segregation and impacts and breaking it down by race and ethnicity and the over-representation of women, and especially Black, Indigenous, and women of color in low-wage occupations, and even among low-wage occupations that women are making less than men. So again, I haven't seen that comprehensive of a study, but Institute for Women's Policy Research is a great resource if you're interested in a lot of the data. They don't do as much as the policy advocacy, but they do a tremendous amount of really good information.
Put that in the chat. And yeah, I have seen some isolated studies of policies in a place, but nothing national. A couple more questions coming in. What happened to junior achievement being at different schools or after school programs? They were present 30 years ago. Is that a financial literacy?
Yes, so junior achievement is still in existence, and they have a wonderful program as far as what junior achievement does is they train usually kind of like a parent volunteer will get to join, or anyone who is somebody that wants to volunteer in the schools, be a part of the community in that sort of way. They'll train them and they'll go into their different classrooms and they will do certain programs. Junior Achievement also does a stock market game throughout the country, and that's really fun for students. They have like a kind of a day-long stock market event. I think Junior Achievement's wonderful. The difference between Junior Achievement and what the councils, and it's an entire network across the nation, does. So there's many states that almost all the states have a state council for economic education. The difference is that we are more of a train the trainer program. So it's really wonderful. Junior Achievement has parents or volunteers that go in for the classroom, and those 30 students or whatever get some fun activities and they get a lesson. What we focus on though is that we're training the teacher, because the teacher touches 100 students a day, every day for an entire semester or a year after year after year. And so it becomes a much bigger multiplier effect for us. And so that's what we try to do, is we try to make sure that the teachers are using engaged techniques and are equipped to handle teaching economics and personal finance. So kind of both have really wonderful goals, just kind of accomplish it a little bit differently. So yeah, Junior Achievement is definitely still around.
Thank you. I had no idea again. I need to study up next time. I think this is for Tiffany. Do you measure this by age? For instance, older women caring for elderly parents who may not have had financial literacy opportunities face blatant workplace discrimination during their early working years. Maybe also for Jamie. I know ageism is a real problem too. We didn't put it in our model, Tiffany, for the gender pay gap, but we absolutely should. And Jamie, are you seeing, I think back to your sort of origin story for this work, age is certainly a factor in women's different financial behaviors. Any other comments on the intersection of maybe age as well as race and ethnicity with some of the findings.
I think Tiffany might be
Frozen.
she might be frozen a little bit.
Sorry.
I'll just answer. I don't have probably as good of research on this as Tiffany might. So in the study that I did, that we looked at the differences among, we split it by age to look at how women in decision makers are. We did find that with the credit card behaviors, there still was a gap, but the gap got a little bit smaller between, you know, the male decision makers and males in general. And we attribute that to a little bit of learning through experience and like learning through doing, although we can't quite definitively say that because we are looking at a cross-sectional study. But if you are engaging in credit card behaviors regularly, you know, you're seeing that. So as far as the discrimination point, I don't think I can speak on that at all. I think maybe Tiffany or maybe Josie with, you have a lot of knowledge, but I think maybe you could answer that.
I'm just so impressed by Tiffany freezing in such a nice pose. Usually when I freeze, it's something, I think it's a terrible face. Good for you, Tiffany. That's the best froze face ever. Yeah, so, and Tiffany showed a little bit of the racial and ethnic intersections with gender and the wage gap. And we are also really seeing that coming out of COVID-19, that the impacts among racial, among persons of color are tremendous. I think it would take a Latino woman till 2024 to get back to the wages she was making in 2019, because the sectors, because some of the reasons we might expect, like industry choices, are impacting that, but other factors there as well. We are coming up on 2:30. I did want to just mention one thing. We are really trying to help build inclusive research in Nebraska. And Tiffany mentioned non-binary. And so in all the sources of data that I pulled for her, non-binary is not an option on the survey. I think it is a fairly new phenomena in research to offer that. And I see a lot of surveys that are doing things like other, so male, female, other, or prefer not to say. I do want to suggest that you offer non-binary or prefer not to say, not other. And Jamie, are you seeing any changes in surveys that you're working with about being a little bit more inclusive in that language?
So I will say, Tiffany, thank you for making that announcement at the beginning, and that caveat applies to mine too. And I kind of realized it halfway through as I was talking, and it was kind of too late. So mine was that same way. I didn't get to choose. I think that surveys in general are lagging. And unless you are actively creating your own surveys, you're up to what surveys have already been created. And so it's lagged and it's needed to change. It's not changing fast enough. So I guess I would implore you all to also be the change, right? Be the change you want to see. So please, you know, it doesn't have to be so binary with that. Absolutely. It actually doesn't have to be. So
yes, I think that's something we've seen. Larger institutional sources for a lot of this data don't adapt as quickly. But if any of you out there are doing your own survey or data work and need suggestions on that language, I have worked out a set of questions around gender, around demographics that make me feel more comfortable and inclusive when I'm asking people about themselves, and a way of asking that allows them to feel fully described. So reach out if you have any questions about that. But I will say the sources that we used in our research together, Tiffany and I, don't do that quite yet, but hopefully soon. And I think Jamie, you know, be the change is a great place to end. So I will see everyone back here at the same link at 3 o'clock for a conversation about aging here in Nebraska. I am going to put the